since he is a deserter, he's always in danger of being exposed to the British and shipped back home to presumably be shot, because, I mean, he's way past the it's okay, and into the, you know, firing squad deal. And I didn't realize until I read your book that there was a sort of active chance that that could happen.
Yep, no, it did happen. Sadly, it's in the British press a lot at the moment. They're thinking of pardoning everyone who was shot for desertion and cowardice during the First World War, which has sort of started a whole new debate. I mean,
really?
Yeah. No, it was a very, very real possibility. I mean, the flip side of that in a place like New York City, where Ben is that suddenly the people who maybe as an Englishman you should be a little bit wary of, which in this case are 8 million German Americans who live among the 100 million people of America, and a very, very large Irish population in New York, are suddenly sort of safe to talk to. I mean, they're sort of they're sort of the place that the British aren't going to be welcome when they come to look for you. So that definitely has a big influence on the parts of New York that Ben starts by exploring.
Right, but I hadn't really thought in terms of the British Army coming to look for you in New York. Was that purposeful, or I mean, did they actually decide that a lot of deserters would go to New York? And
no, it was a hard thing to get to New York, and I could only come up with one case where it actually happened, which was good enough for me.
Oh, okay, all right. So it wasn't like a concerted program to.
No, but of course, what happens in this book is that certain people report Ben to authorities at some point. So that's where the focus.
All part of the.
That's where the focus comes in. Yeah.
Well, it was. I also think that Americans today are so far away from it, they don't realize what went on here, because America didn't go into the war until 17, so it had been going on for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
And probably it was the strength of the American troops and their freshness that helped swing things, because everybody else was worn out by it. I've always thought it was the stupidest war in history. I mean, it was fought over what, like 5 or 10 miles, and nobody ever called it off.
Yeah.
It was a war that should have been settled, you know, dramatically, quickly.
Yeah.
And it just provided cannon fodder for all kinds of innocent people to accomplish absolutely nothing.
Well, it does change the landscape in one vital and enormous way, which is that before the war, not all the wealth of the world, but an enormous amount of the wealth of the world was in the hands of England and Germany and France.
Right.
And they're all detonations by the end of the war. And
Russia.
And Russia. And over here, you had J.P. Morgan Jr. in New York, who battled through with Congress and the Senate to launch a war loan of $500 million, awful lot of money in those days, which very much not only kept the war alive, but also meant that America ended up at the end of the war with, you know, if it was a game of Monopoly, you know, America would have won hands down. So it really does change the landscape and puts the pieces in position for what then happens over the next.
Absolutely so. I have a very hard time reading books with an Edwardian background, because you always know it's like reading books about America from 1830 on. I mean, you just know, there's this elephant there in the room and there's this terrible shadow that the coming Civil War or the coming, World War I casts over everything, and I find them very hard to read. Maybe it's just. I mean, World War II was a little clearer, I think, about what everybody was fighting for, and even though it's going to be horrendous, it doesn't have the emotional drain, I find, and maybe that's the reason why there are so many, even today, authors mining all kinds of facets of World War II, things we didn't even know about, like the Swiss roll, or, the Vatican hiding, or the French clerics hiding, and all the rest of it. I mean, so many things have come out as records have become available, as, time has given us perspective. And there's a lot about World War II that you couldn't have written about in the 1950s, say, because it was just way too close.
Yeah.
And I think World War I has got a different emotional resonance for most people, but there's been quite a lot written about it recently.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. Above all things, it's a terrible sense of just utter waste.
Waste. I mean, what did it accomplish? I mean, you're right that afterward there were some tremendous dislocations and all, and it was the end of, it was the end of monarchy in Germany. It was the end of, the Romanov dynasty. Yeah. Amazing too how closely they were all related. I always find that part fascinating. I mean, Wilhelm and Nicholas and George were all cousins. They were all descendants of Victoria. So I've even read theories that say, that if Edward VII had just lived longer, that he was the only person apparently who could sort of thump the Kaiser, who was his nephew, I think. That it might have been avoided if he had stayed alive and been able to exercise a firmer hand. But that's just speculation. Yeah. That's like saying if Woodrow Wilson hadn't had a stroke and that the whole Treaty of Versailles and a lot of the history of that and of what happened would have gone differently. Right? Or if Franklin Roosevelt hadn't been dying. The person I admire the most, and I was brought up in a household in which he was truly anathema because I was brought up in a very Republican household. But Harry Truman, I've always thought, here was a man who was absolutely pitchforked into the last months of the war with no real preparation because he was such a cipher that nobody really brought him up to speed. He didn't know a lot of what was going on. And I've always thought he was an amazing man and that he was able to kind of, take charge. But there's a lot of thought, for example, that if Patton hadn't been kept dilly-dallying about, that, who would have gotten to Berlin first, and would the whole Iron Curtain and Berlin thing have gone the way it was?
Which is another great playground for
novelists. It is, but there are a lot of medical theories about history. If only so-and-so hadn't died or gotten sick or, whatever. Would Henry VIII have been king if his brother hadn't died in Ludlow Castle is always one of the ones that I find interesting because I think Henry was a real monster. So it goes. So I do think that you're operating in a fascinating territory. What are you going to do next?
I've got a couple of things up and running. On the novel side, I'm jumping. I'm sure you noticed, but every book I've written seems to creep closer to the modern day. This time we went 18th, 19th, the early 20th century. Now I'm moving all the way up into the 1980s.
Wow!
And I'm writing about Peru and kidnapping in the Caribbean in the United States. There you go, nice. Another light. You see, I can't keep away from crime. There you go. Another kind of crime.
Peru is a fascinating country. I was there in the mid-70s, and I thought it was fascinating. But there was still not a lot of travel there because of the Shining Path.
Shining Path.
It was kind of a scary place to go. Now the earthquake seems to be slightly worse than the politics. But wow. Yeah. And the other project?
The other project is a film project I've been hired to do about Sir Richard Burton, the British explorer in the 19th century. That will shift
Burton
me back.
And Speke and the whole
Well, this is before. This is Burton and Mecca, when this is, the Englishman who disguises himself as a Muslim pilgrim and goes on the journey to Mecca.
One of the great linguists of all time, Richard Burton.
Yep. Supposedly 28 languages. But
imagine, successfully passing himself off, at that point as a genuine Arab pilgrim. To Mecca, when the penalty would have been... I've never forgiven his wife. I think one of the most tragic parts about Sir Richard Burton's life was his dreadful wife who burned all his best work when he died.
Unforgivable.
It is unforgivable. It's one of those other things that just breaks your heart because you think, he had so much work. I think it's been well documented that he left, and we'll never know what it was.
Well, I think we know that she was definitely compared to him, a prude. Of course, he was the exact opposite. So they always say that this was his saltiest 1,000 pages or 2,000 pages filled with things she just didn't want.
You could write a whole book about the most unlikely marriage. If ever two people probably should never have come within miles of each other, it has to have been Mr.
It's it is a fascinating marriage. He seemed to spend half his time running away from her, but.
And who could blame him? Well, anyway, you could certainly write volumes about Burton. What fun.
Yeah, no, it's going to be an interesting project.
Was it Fawn Brody that wrote that great book about him?
The Devil Drives. Is that the one?
I think so.
Yeah.
Very
which
good
is
book.
using a lot of psychoanalysis to look into his choices.
I've always been fascinated with him. But what fun. Well, I'll have lots more things to look forward to, Nicholas. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me. And
thank you so much.
Bringing us all up to speed on your career. And I certainly thank all of you for coming with us today on this journey into the past, moving up to the present.